A normal day, Peppa and George are playing with dolls. One of them was strange. Its head was slightly tilted to the side. Peppa carefully turned the broken doll. A thin crack appeared on the face of the porcelain doll. Sometimes a small crack is just a premonition of something terrible. The light in the room flickered for a second. At that moment, Evie in the crib flinched and fell silent. She was no longer breathing evenly. Black liquid was dripping from the crack in the doll. Peppa ran to the crib, but it was empty. The outlines of tiny fingers had disappeared, replaced by cold fingerprints. A trail of black liquid stretched from the crib to the dollhouse. Horrified, Peppa took George's hand and led him there. In the central room sat the puppeteer, a figure with a porcelain face, but with cracks running all over its body. In its hands was Evie, like a doll, her eyes closed, unmoving. The puppeteer lifted its head and slowly opened its eyes. They glowed red. It stroked Evie's cheek and said,
"My new doll."
Peppa and George froze as if held by an invisible force. The dollhouse continues to play, even if the players are silent. Doll Evie spoke in a creepy voice.
"You are next."
Deleted episode of Peppa Pig, the ominous song. This episode was never aired on TV. It all started when Peppa and George found an old music box in a chest in the attic. George accidentally wound it up, and a strange, unnatural melody began to play. The music was eerie, almost as if it shouldn't be heard at that moment. The music grew louder, and the air in the room turned cold and heavy. Suddenly, the walls began to ripple as though they were breathing. Shadows on the walls began to come alive, stretching into odd, twisted shapes that moved around the room. Peppa and George noticed their reflections in the mirror had become distorted. Their eyes were enormous, and their smiles twisted into something unnatural, like they weren't their own. "I can't take this anymore," whispered Peppa, grabbing George's hand. But when they tried to leave, the door was locked. The music grew louder, and the room began to fill with darkness. At that moment, Papa Pig rushed into the room, his face twisted in a strange smile. He saw the music box and said with surprise, "This is my old music box. I thought I lost it years ago." But his voice was different, deep and unnatural. "Papa, what's happening to you?" asked Peppa in fear. As soon as Papa Pig touched the box, his body began to distort. His face twisted, his eyes darkened, and his arms elongated unnaturally. "Now I can play again," he whispered, and his laugh, low and metallic, filled the room. Peppa and George watched in horror as Papa Pig lost all human form, his body collapsing into a shadow that couldn't stop moving. "I can't stop it," he said, and his figure faded into the darkness, swallowed by emptiness. The box started playing again. The music became unbearably loud, echoing through the room as if the room itself was alive. The walls cracked, and the shadows grew more menacing. Suddenly, Peppa and George felt something pulling them inside. They couldn't move, couldn't resist. "What's happening?" screamed George, but his voice was drowned by the music. At that moment, everything around them turned dark, and the room disappeared. Instead, they found themselves in an endless void, an abyss, where there was nothing but the sound of the music. Inside the box, everything was closed off, consuming them into its vast depths. Peppa and George stood in this nightmarish void, surrounded by dark shadows that wouldn't let them go. Their bodies grew heavier, and the music became more unbearable, as if it were a part of this endless darkness. "Are we stuck here forever?" whispered Peppa. And just as they tried to speak their last words, everything around them dissolved into the darkness, and the sound of the box merged with the silence. The music stopped, and the episode ended. Deleted Peppa Pig episode, The Spider. This Peppa Pig episode was never aired on television. It was removed. And now it's clear why. It all started like a normal day. George was playing on the carpet, Peppa was organizing her toys, and Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper. Mummy Pig was cooking breakfast. Everything felt calm, until George screamed. He said something had bitten him on his leg, 2 tiny puncture marks. No one paid much attention. A few hours later, George became sluggish. His face turned pale. He wasn't talking or eating. He just sat, breathing heavily. By evening, he stopped moving. That night, Peppa woke up to a strange noise. There was a rustling sound coming from the living room. George's bed was empty. Peppa went to look for him, and she found him. In the corner of the living room hung a web, huge like a tent, and inside it, George. He was stuck to the wall with webbing. His eyes were open, black, but he didn't move. His stomach was swollen. Something was moving inside. An hour later, Daddy Pig disappeared. Then Mummy Pig. Peppa was alone. The web was growing. It wrapped around furniture, walls, and the ceiling. The house was turning into a cocoon. She heard breathing. Behind her, she turned. The spider. Huge, black, hairy, crawling along the walls. It moved toward George. One leg touched his stomach. The swelling cracked open. From inside crawled a small spider, spider-like, with a monstrous version of George's face. It twitched. Peppa ran to her room. The last thing she saw, her parents already hanging from the ceiling. Then she saw their faces, distorted and terrifying. Threads were pulling out of their mouths. In the evening, Peppa went home, but the road veered off to the side. She saw familiar faces, Susie, Rebecca, Denny, and new ones, pale and motionless. In the center of the circle, a puddle of black liquid reflecting the sky, but distorted. They stood silently, waiting. Peppa slowly approached. Susie turned her head abruptly without blinking. Her eyes, empty sockets, a black drop at the corner of her mouth. All the children simultaneously turned their heads toward Peppa, synchronously, faces devoid of emotion. The puddle in the center of the circle pulsed, gentle ripples emanating from it. Peppa stepped back. The children reached their hands out at the same time, their fingers elongated, black liquid flowing from them. The children's mouths opened to an unnatural width, but silently. The puddle in the center suddenly stretched upward, forming a black tentacle reaching toward Peppa. Peppa ran. When she looked back, everything had disappeared. But it was worse. Numerous trails of black slime led in different directions. Some led to Peppa's gate. Someone left with her, or followed her. Midnight, Peppa sat on her bed, drawing a circle in her notebook. A shadow near the door began to change. It was the silhouette of one of the children from the circle. Beyond the door, the park. That very park. Children in a circle. She was among them, standing hand in hand with the others. If Peppa isn't with them, then who is in the circle? Her eyes became as empty as Susie's. She slowly smiled. Suddenly, a face, blurred, eye sockets empty, mouth twisted into a grin, black liquid dripping, darkness flooding everything. You are already standing in the circle. You just don't know it yet.